September 1938 feels close enough to touch. Train stations glow at dusk. Queues form at newsstands. Wireless sets crackle through narrow flats and crowded cafes. Europe listens for one phrase only: war avoided. In Munich, delegations arrive with careful posture and measured smiles. The corridors smell of polish and tobacco. Polite greetings cover up calculations that seem to move faster than the clock. Borders are discussed as if they are lines on a map and not lived ground. The word peace is used often, yet its shape keeps changing. This program presents a speculative narrative reconstruction built from public histories, archives, and open records. It aims to be faithful to the era's atmosphere, while acknowledging gaps that may never be fully closed. The story follows press bulletins, cabinet notes, and contemporary reports. Some motives appear clear. Others remain unclear, filtered through edited minutes and cautious diaries. What you will hear is not a verdict. It is a guided walk through a tense week when Europe paused on a narrow ledge. The tone is calm. The detail is concrete. Speculation is noted with care. We remain inside the period, inside the rooms and streets of 1938. There are no modern digressions, only the immediate pressures of a continent trying to buy time with paper and signatures. The next voice is the room itself, holding its breath as doors begin to close. The pressure that led to Munich built over ordinary days with ordinary habits. Clerks filed papers, shopkeepers weighed sugar, and conscripts cleaned rifles that they hoped to put away again soon. In London and Paris, the streets learned new rhythms. People paused at windows where maps hung behind glass. Shop boys kept one ear on the wireless, while sweeping thresholds. Rail timetables became a kind of barometer. Each special train for a diplomatic party signaled another step toward a decision grown too large for the hour. Across cafes and tram stops, the talk circled back to the same fear that a loud morning might come without warning. The Sudeten crisis gave that fear a direction. Headlines framed it as a dispute that might be settled by negotiation if the right words were found. Yet the words kept shifting. In official buildings, the light burned late. Cabinet minutes suggest that options were weighed with an eye on public mood and military readiness, a pair of scales that rarely balanced. In Prague, the mood was sharper. Any concession would not be abstract there. It would be hills, bridges, and towns. It would be families told to move or accept a new flag. Reports from the border districts noted gatherings after dark, shutters tight, and radios turned low. The language of reassurance sounded gentle in the capitals, but it traveled poorly over distance. The men preparing to fly or ride to Germany visited their tailors and barbers with unsteady hearts. They practiced the phrases that might make a difference. No one spoke of victory. Most spoke of delay. Delay meant hope. Delay meant factories could complete orders, airfields could add shelters, and engineers could finish the next ring of concrete. The crowd sensed this even if no one said it out loud. Newspapers printed large type for the word peace and small type for the conditions that defined it. Telegraph desks rattled late into the night. When the invitations to Munich were confirmed, there was a pause across the cities, as if a single intake of breath had been coordinated by an unseen hand. Special correspondents checked their satchels and pressed their passes into their hatbands. Clerks delivered sealed folders to cars at side doors. The departing motorcades were met with restrained applause, more polite than cheerful. Photographs taken that evening show faces tilted upward, hopeful and tired. What could be promised in one room might not hold in the next. That quiet suspicion lingered around the edges of every streetlight. The flight south was smooth according to later memoirs, but the descent felt steep. Munich station and airfield were orderly, almost ceremonial. Flags hung in careful lines. The city looked clean and expectant. The chosen hotel rooms had heavy curtains and well-oiled hinges. At the reception, the introductions were clipped and formal. Each man seemed to represent a ledger of lives and days. A few private comments were exchanged in low voices, none long enough to change the weather. The tone was set by the venue and by a clock that would not stop. Outside, Munich's residents watched a procession that hinted at calm while implying the opposite. There were smiles for the cameras. There were also glances at wristwatches. The first private consultations began almost at once, with staff notes collected and copied with haste. Two indicators survive in the public record that help anchor this hour. Press communiques announced the intention to seek an orderly solution, and draft meeting agendas outlined the sequence of discussions. Neither document promised more than a process. The process, for a brief moment, was enough to keep the trains running and the shops open. The next sequence belongs to the chamber where maps lay on green baize and voices kept to a careful register, as the night session took shape inside a room that sounded larger with every echo. The first session moved with a rhythm learned from past crises. Courtesies were observed, coats were taken, pens were placed at right angles on blotters. The participants spoke in complete sentences that avoided adjectives. Each sentence carried more weight than its length suggested. There was an agreed script for the opening, then a narrowing focus that returned again and again to the same set of points. Territory, timing, guarantees. The order changed, yet the gravity did not. The maps on the table were old enough to appear neutral. Colored grease pencil added emphasis where words could not. Staff brought in trays with water and thin coffee. Cigarettes burned to ash. The room did not grow warmer. It grew thinner, as if the air was being used for bargaining. The German position sounded firm and final. The demand was framed as a correction that history would recognize as natural. The counterpoint from London and Paris tried to turn the momentum into a staged process. Sequencing could soften impact. Dates could buy readiness. The words seemed to help until they did not. Each attempt to slow the pace met the same reply. The border must move. Now or soon? Soon would be registered as now. The absence of Prague from the table pressed on the tone of the room. An empty chair does not speak, but it changes the sound of every voice. Notes taken by aides indicate that drafts were exchanged with small edits, and that attachment pages multiplied as the hour lengthened. The draft agreement text, later printed in evening editions, contained words that appeared neutral, but carried sharp edges when placed against a map. Concessions were called adjustments. Transfers were called arrangements. Assurances were called understandings. A second indicator is found in staff schedules preserved in several archives. The schedules show the room turning at late hours, with short breaks that brought no relief. The break served to record consent, not to reconsider it. The calculation in one corner of the room weighed the fear of immediate war against the hope of future preparation. The calculation in the opposite corner measured pressure against precedent. The difference between these sums was the shape of the treaty. The hall outside grew quiet. The press waited with pens poised, ready to convert any phrase into calm. Inside, a packet of pages gained signatures that were dignified and tidy. Photo lamps flared, smiles registered as brief and polite. The journey from words to lines on maps was complete. It did not look like a victory. It looked like a pause written in careful handwriting. The chemistry of the room changed after the signatures. Voices lowered, chairs scraped. Coats were fetched. No one rushed, but no one lingered. The men who had argued for time had obtained time measured in weeks or months, not years. They knew it without saying so. The room was emptied of meaning as soon as it emptied of people. The text remained folded into portfolios and sealed envelopes. Outside, cars rolled toward guarded gates. The night air carried a feeling that would be felt across the continent before dawn. It was the relief produced by a narrow escape combined with the knowledge that the exit led into a corridor, not a field. The bridge from this room leads to the streets and parlors where the agreement would be received, summarized, and judged by faces tilted toward billboards and radios in Prague, London, and Paris. News of the agreement moved faster than trains. Typesetters set the words, "Peace with Honor," in a size that could be read across a street. Vendors called the headline and waved fresh stacks under bright lamps. Crowds gathered at stations and squares in the cool morning. A strange combination of clapping and quiet overcame the first hour. People did not want to appear ungrateful for calm, yet they did not trust it. In London, politicians returned to cheering lines and polite bands. A few short statements promised stability and promised review. The word guarantee appeared often, though its content was thin. In Paris, the welcome was subdued. Families looked at sons who were nearly of age and decided the paper was a mercy. They also noticed the map printed on page 2. In Prague, the morning felt different. The state most affected had not sat at the table. The tone in offices and schools moved from shock to a settled, tired anger. Trains filled with families from the border towns. They arrived with furniture draped in blankets and with clocks wrapped in coats. Police tried to keep order among platforms that were never meant to hold such grief. The agreement had an immediate life in the countryside as well. Patrols measured roads. Small bridges carried more traffic than usual. Village halls held meetings where questions outnumbered chairs. The same text produced three moods: relief, resignation, and a third feeling that has no simple name. It was a readiness to rebuild the day while keeping a suitcase near the door. Evening editions carried photographs of smiles and signatures. They carried in smaller type the paragraphs that detailed transfers and dates. Two reliable indicators helped ground the scene. Evening editions preserved in library stacks showed jubilant titles above cool detail. Parliamentary records show short debates that praised restraint and asked, carefully, about contingencies. The dissent that did exist was quiet, contained inside party rooms and newspaper offices where the editors chose adjectives with care. Some warned that meeting demands could encourage more demands. Others argued that the pause would allow factories to complete work and barracks to add beds. In districts far from capitals, the news arrived by wireless in crowded rooms. Public houses turned the volume up and then down. Teachers wrote the day's word on blackboards and tried to explain it without frightening children. At supper tables, the agreement changed the conversation. Couples planned a holiday again, then canceled it. A mother moved a basket of apples to cover a crack in the kitchen window. Small acts gave shape to a fragile peace. The shine of the moment began to dull after a few days. Questions multiplied. How would the transfers occur? Who would count the days? What would be done if a clause was pressed to the edge of its meaning? The answer sounded firm at first. They grew softer when tested. Through it all, officials maintained a tone of propriety. They held photo calls, arranged courtesy visits, and issued communiques that soothed markets. The missing piece in every statement was the voice from the ceded ground. Those voices were heard only in letters and in columns buried under the fold. They described roads thick with carts, old men sitting on trunks, and children looking back at houses that would soon fly a different flag. The weeks ahead would convert clauses into actions and actions into new routines. Trains would lead out and back. Border posts would move to fresh ditches. Police would learn new routes. The transition would be watched by neighbors and by distant observers who saw a pattern taking its first steps. The next scene turns to those first days of implementation when timetables, checkpoints, and uniforms began to shift in the border hills and the ledger of peace was opened to its first entries. Implementation began with paper that moved faster than people could. Schedules arrived by courier, stamped and countersigned, then pinned to station walls. The first convoys rolled at dawn, quiet and deliberate on damp roads. Trucks carried officials who reviewed fences, bridges, and crossroads with practiced eyes. Families from the ceded districts packed neatly, labeling trunks with chalk. They moved objects that could be lifted and left what could not. Railway platforms filled before sunrise with crates tied by rope and patience. A clerk called names from a list that seemed to lengthen with each hour. The language of transfer was calm on paper and heavy in practice. There were men in uniform who nodded without comment and wrote down numbers. There were women who kept children close while checking pocket watches. The ground itself felt involved. The hills kept their shape while the signs changed. Place names were repainted with careful strokes that hid earlier paint under fresh coats. Church bells marked the hours. Shopkeepers counted coins and wondered which ones would hold value tomorrow. The columns entering the territory moved as if guided by rulers and clocks. They paused at agreed markers while representatives checked maps with gloved fingers. The local police saluted both ways, then learned which salute to keep. In one village hall, a meeting resolved to hold no meeting tomorrow. In another, school lessons shifted to words that felt familiar and foreign together. The work of border change is small work repeated many times. It is keys exchanged in doorways and ink drying in ledgers. It is a new seal pressed into soft wax and then pressed again when the first impression proves faint. Signalmen consulted pocketbooks and adjusted levers for altered routes. Field telephones rang in neat sequences that sounded like counting. The papers required were often in order, although not always complete. Luggage was opened and closed without rancor. People tried not to look back when the line began to move. The atmosphere suggested that order would make everything simpler. It also suggested that order could be used to erase doubt by sheer repetition. Two indicators anchor the rhythm of these days. Railway circulars preserved in company archives list the new service patterns and the station names under revised administration. Provincial press notices instruct residents where to collect identity slips and how to present them to the reception teams. The text is plain and leaves no space for ornament. On certain roads, tractors pulled low trailers stacked with furniture under canvas. Dogs followed until called back by whistled names. The leaving looked temporary in the morning and permanent by evening. Some houses were left swept clean, with curtains washed and tied. A few carried a scrap of paper on the kitchen table that said only farewell in simple words. The incoming authorities walked the lanes along hedges, counting intersections and barns. They noted wells and mills. They noted who shook hands and who kept arms folded. A rumor of resistance faded when no signal came. The agreement had promised an orderly passage of days. The passage held, but only because everyone understood how much worse disorder might feel. Work crews measured bridges for weight limits and chalked figures on stones. Postmasters sorted sacks of mail that could not find their destination anymore. Children asked which songs to sing in school. Teachers answered with safe songs known to both sides. The horizon remained unchanged, although the gaze upon it altered. A new notice board went up near the market square by afternoon. It carried the proclamation under a bold header and firm serif letters. It requested cooperation and cheerful patience. People read it without moving their lips. They looked for the lines that mattered. They found them quickly. Checkpoints closed at 9. Stores could open at 7. Travel to the next valley required a paper with 2 stamps. Life continued with the speed of ink drying. Farm laborers stacked hay with careful forks while trucks passed on the far road. A man lifted his hat to a column and then put it on again. The first evening under the new arrangement was quiet in most places. Lamps burned a little later and curtains were drawn a little tighter. Radios carried announcements that stressed good order and neighborly behavior. They also named dates that could not be ignored. People marked calendars with a stub of pencil and made lists by lantern light. The mood was neither festive nor grim. It was attentive, like a room waiting for the next instruction. Police stations logged inquiries about property, papers, and pensions. A few were answered quickly. Most were marked pending. The border hills absorbed these movements with their usual calm. They had seen shepherds and tax collectors before. They would see them again. What changed now was the number of men who walked the lanes in pairs and wrote notes on boards. Their handwriting differed, their purpose did not. The final trains of the week carried officials back to the city with reports that stressed progress and discipline. They listed disturbances in small type and noted them resolved by afternoon. The stack of reports grew and pressed evenly on the desk of a man who valued neat piles. The next scene leaves these hills and turns toward the offices where numbers were converted into statements, and statements were converted into policy for the week ahead. In the capitals, the language of relief persisted, yet planning deepened. Memoranda moved between ministries with headings that balanced optimism and caution. The format looked familiar. The content had more weight. There were commitments to review defenses quietly while maintaining the tone of goodwill. Personnel departments checked roll books and penciled notes beside names required for future training cycles. Transport officials conferred about fuel stocks and bridge timetables. They aimed to keep movement smooth without drawing attention to increased capacity. In factory districts, morning whistles sounded as usual. Workers filed in with flasks and lunch tins. The day felt ordinary, yet notices on boards hinted at extra shifts next week. Managers spoke in even tones about output targets without naming dates. The raw materials arrived in careful flows that could be explained as routine. It was easier to call everything routine for now. The press continued to laud restraint and printed photographs of smiling delegations. Short columns, placed deeper inside, summarized debates about risk and guarantee. Parliamentary questions were answered with tidy phrases that seemed composed to fit into narrow columns. Across the channel, similar phrases were used, almost as if agreed in advance. Two indicators helped fix the character of this period. Cabinet extracts later released show-line items for preparedness, framed as maintenance and review. Trade bulletins note orders placed under ordinary headings that suited ordinary ledgers. None of this was secret in the dramatic sense. It was the kind of quiet that looks like tidiness unless you count the totals. In offices that mattered, the clocks were watched closely. The interval purchased at Munich was treated like a working loan. Payments were scheduled in hours and days. Fresh air raid instructions were typed and then filed, to be issued only if a signal was given. Volunteers for civil duties were invited to register at polite desks. Their names were entered with fountain pens that leaked on humid days. In rail yards, crews inspected couplings and brake hoses with extra care. They moved engines onto sidings for cleaning and small upgrades. None of this announced a change in policy. It announced a desire to be ready for any policy that might be required. The public tone avoided talk of urgency. It spoke of prudence. Prudence is a calm word that can hide hard edges. In cafes, the same men who had cheered now argued in murmurs. Some believed the agreement had prevented a catastrophe. Others believed it had postponed one. Both sides ordered the same coffee. The argument did not break the cups. In military schools, instructors repeated lessons with tighter schedules. They reviewed maps and corridors with names that the newspapers had made familiar. Aims remained defensive in description, although every defense implies a line that can be crossed. The week ended with speeches that celebrated cooperation and good sense. They were crafted to fit the hour. They named no adversary. They praised the citizens who carried on in good order. In the same hour, files moved to locked cabinets with new labels. The labels were innocuous, but the sequence was unmistakable to anyone who watched it every day. A few dissenting voices met in small rooms to draft editorials that asked for firmer positions. Their language was civil. It carried an old memory of broken promises. Editors adjusted headlines to reduce heat and keep papers on sale in districts tired of alarm. It was difficult to sell more fear. It was easy to sell the appearance of peace. Ships continued to load coal and grain. The prices steadied. The sea looked the same from the promenade. People walked after supper and watched dogs chase gulls. The sensation of ordinary life edged back into evenings and settled over streets like a cover. Under that cover, departments wrote new lists and filed them under old names. The discrepancy between surface and preparation was not deception exactly. It was an agreement to proceed by steps that allowed sleep. The files described nothing dramatic. They describe errands, guidelines, and careful inventories. A ministry circular specified how to protect important ledgers from damp basements. Another advised staff on the preservation of maps during frequent handling. These details matter when decisions are pressed into days. The last week of that month ended with a meeting where senior officials agreed to meet again, soon, to discuss matters that could not be printed yet. The next scene returns to the borderlands and to the towns where the clauses of the agreement began to meet the appetite of fresh demands and the air turned thinner by daily pressure. The border zones settled into a routine that never felt routine. Patrols walked predictable paths along verges marked by new posts. A farmer learned where to stop his cart and where to lift his hat. Villages adapted to stamps and signatures. The new offices opened on time and closed on time. Long lines formed anyway. The arrangement on paper looked straightforward. Its application created corners where interpretation carried power. A word like immediate gained hours and then days. A statement like orderly transfer collected exceptions until it held less weight. People learned to ask for names and to remember them. They learned which officer preferred calm replies and which preferred speed. Out in the fields, children counted columns and retreated before they passed. The feeling of pause began to feel like waiting for a bell. Quiet incidents tested clauses. A boundary stone was placed 2 paces forward and then returned. A school teacher was told to report and then told to stay home. A short train was stopped at a level crossing and then waved through. None of these moments broke anything visible, yet each left a mark. The hills recorded them as faint lines of habit. Evening gatherings in town halls continued behind closed shutters. The minutes were brief and neat. They carried decisions about rations, curfews, and the allocation of uniforms for local watchmen. Two indicators help frame this tightening climate. Municipal gazettes list new bylaw schedules for closing hours and market days under revised authority. A series of press communiques mention isolated disturbances settled on the spot without further detail. The words were chosen to assure distant readers. They did not assure those standing in the square. The first month after the agreement closed with a series of visits by senior officials. They traveled by motorcade and spoke in sentences designed to calm. They thanked the towns for their cooperation and signaled that more adjustments would follow with fairness. People listened and kept their hands by their sides. After the speeches, notice boards filled again. There were new forms for residency declarations and new lines for ration cards, valid under the updated jurisdiction. Some faces appeared twice at the windows. They had already filled a form with similar boxes last week. The repetition gave a sense of structure and also of attrition. A small number left altogether for relatives in safer districts. Their departures were folded into the larger movement of people already underway. The landscape absorbed them without comment. The memory of Munich as a promise of peace began to thin. It remained in a photograph on a mantel and in a headline saved in a drawer. It did not determine the next instruction handed out to a baker or a guard. The civic religion of normal hours and simple errands could not fully return. The edge had moved closer to daily life. In the larger capital, speeches still placed emphasis on cooperation. The vocabulary was decorous and plain. Yet beneath that vocabulary, the instruments of state learned to move more quickly. Files traveled with flags attached. Meetings began earlier and stretched later. There were seasonal explanations for some of this. There were other explanations that remained between pages. In correspondences not meant for readers, officials mentioned a pressure that did not decrease. It drifted from border to border and placed itself on each desk with the morning mail. The sense of reprieve had been spent on schedules and signatures. It produced careful days and quiet nights. It did not erase the causes that brought the delegations to Munich. Each week that followed added small weight to the same side of the scale. People in the border districts sensed this and stopped asking for expansive assurances. They asked for clear times and clear passages. They asked for bridges to remain open and for local trains to keep running. Their questions were practical and reasonable. They were answered often with practical and reasonable replies. The replies held until they did not. The scene tightens here. The paper architecture of the agreement looks intact from a distance. Up close, its joints creak when pushed. A new round of messages circulates between ministries and posts, noting incidents that require review and the phrase, "further discussion." The hour grows late again. The next passage returns to the rooms where those discussions will be framed into sentences, and where a future meeting, hinted at in cautious language, begins to take shape around fresh demands and the memory of signatures still drying on a table in Munich. The weeks after Munich did not dissolve into relief. They settled into a managed quiet that felt provisional, even to those who wanted it to last. Offices worked longer hours. Border towns learned a new grammar for simple tasks. The picture in the papers remained tidy, yet the caption gained more lines with every edition. This narrative is a reconstruction from public records, archived minutes, and contemporary reports. It treats motives with care and events with restraint. It avoids claims that cannot be supported by credible traces. Where the sources fall silent, the language remains conditional. The story ends this hour inside the same rooms where it began. The chairs are back in place. The blotters are fresh. The folders sit labeled for future use. Outside, the streets hold their shape under winter light. Trains keep their time with a precision that comforts and misleads. The agreement still exists as a set of sentences that sound reasonable when read aloud. Their strength now depends on how far they can bend. Will the next agenda hold to the same words, or will the words be pressed until they mean something else? Will the public mood accept another pause, or will patience reach its limit in smaller towns before it fails in the capitals? The records do not answer. They only suggest that new drafts are being prepared and that couriers know the route. The doors have not closed. They might not close for some time. The bridge to the next chapter is a corridor lit by shaded lamps, where fresh communiques are composed while a clerk notes, with even handwriting, that further consultations may be required.